Chapter 40, page 184, Silvernails and Big Tub. England had 13 American colonies. Remember, a colony is a place that belongs to another country. You'll be reading about all 13 of the English colonies, but because they turned into the United States, we're going to divide the colonies into 3 groups: North, Middle, and South. The New England colonies, the Middle Atlantic colonies, and the Southern colonies. The New England colonies are Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. The Middle Atlantic colonies are New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. The Southern colonies are Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Some people call Maryland a middle colony. Don't confuse states with colonies. The 13 colonies will turn into states later when the Constitution is written and our nation, the United States, is formed. Let's turn to one of the middle colonies, New York, where the Dutch are in control. It wasn't called New York at first, as you'll see. The Dutch had colonies all over the world. It's hard for us to realize how that tiny Holland was once a great power. A business firm, the Dutch West India Company, owned most of the colonies, just as the Virginia and Plymouth companies owned English colonies. Back in 1609, Henry Hudson, an Englishman sailing for the Netherlands, had gone up the river that is now called the Hudson. He was looking for the Northwest Passage, and the river seemed likely, but he was stopped by rapids in the river near Albany. Because of Hudson's voyage, Holland claimed a large hunk of American land. It was land wedged between the stern Puritans in the north and the Anglican tobacco planters in the south. The Dutch called it New Netherland. Today we know it as New York and New Jersey. The Dutch had a great piece of property, but they didn't seem to realize that. They just kind of fooled around on the North American continent. They were more serious in other parts of the globe. For example, the Dutch thought India, with its silks and spices, which was much more important than America. Top of page 185. In 1626, the Dutch West India Company made what may be the most famous real estate deal in history. It bought Manhattan Island, now the center of New York City, and Long Island from the Indians, who lived there for some beads and goods said to be worth $24. Since the Indians didn't think people could own land, they may have thought they were outsmarting the white men. By this time, the Dutch had decided that American furs might be almost as good as American gold, so they set up some trading posts. People in Europe were eager to buy American furs. Beaver, bear, fox, and other fur pelts could be made into sumptuous hats, coats, and blankets. The Dutch merchant hoped to get rich in the New World. On Manhattan Island, the people from Holland built a town called New Amsterdam. At one end, they put a wall because they feared wolves and because cities in Europe had walls. Today, that wall is the site of a famous street. Can you guess what it's called? You guessed it, Wall Street. Outside the wall were farms, which the Dutch called Boeries. Today, a street in New York is called the Bowery. It doesn't look much like a farm now. Top of page 186. Because of its great harbor, New Amsterdam was soon a sailor's town, bustling with people who arrived on ships from faraway places. It was said you could hear 18 different languages being spoken in the city of New Amsterdam. Right away, in 1626, the Dutch brought slaves to New Amsterdam. You could buy a slave for about the same amount it would cost to pay a worker 1 year's salary. So some people thought it made good sense to own slaves. It was an economic or money decision. When it came to colonial leaders, the Dutch came up with some strange men, such as Old Silvernails. That's what they called him, because the stick of wood that stood in place on his right leg was decorated with silver nails. He had lost his leg in the battle in the West Indies. His real name was Piet Stuyvesant, and he was a Dutch governor and a hard-swearing, tough man. Maybe the Dutch thought Silvernails Stuyvesant was the right kind of person to run a colony in America. Maybe they didn't have any other volunteers. Grouchy old Silvernails was in charge of all of New Netherland. He was pretty good at running things. He would stomp his wooden leg and swear at anyone who disagreed with him. When the Dutchmen who had been elected councillors objected to something he said, he called them ignorant subjects. Another time he said he would ship them back to Holland in pieces if they gave him trouble. 187. If you were going to run a swearing contest, Stuyvesant might lose. Johann Prince, who had a mouth that was even more foul. He was the governor of New Sweden on the Delaware Bay, not far from New Netherland. Prince was a whale of a man. The Indians called him Big Tub, and he may have been the biggest man on the continent. He was 7 feet tall and weighed 400 pounds. Big Tub was an aristocrat, an absolute ruler, and he liked to hang people who opposed him. But he did hold his colony together for 10 years with very little help from the Swedes at home. And he introduced a new style of architecture, the log cabin, that became popular in frontier settlements. Finally, Johann Prince got tired of trying to run things himself and went back to Sweden. The new Swedish governor decided to get tough and capture a Dutch fort, but he didn't realize what old Silvernails was like. Stuyvesant sent 7 ships, and that wiped out the Swedish colony. That made Stuyvesant popular in New Amsterdam, but not for long. 9 years later, in 1664, the English decided to do to the Dutch what the Dutch had done to the Swedes. Old Silvernail stomped on his wooden leg, but nobody came to his rescue. The British took New Amsterdam without firing a shot. They renamed it New York. Page 188, Chapter 41, West to Jersey. The Netherlands pulled down its flag and left America. It was 1664, and the Dutch had been there for 50 years. During those years, they had gone up the Hudson River, built a town at Fort Orange, Albany, and established big plantations along the river. The Dutch farm owners were called patroons. People came from Holland to work the patroons' farm. They brought their tulips, their hard-working habits, their neatness, and their storytelling ways with them. Their children's favorite story was about a fellow named Santa Claus, who visited just before Christmas on December 6th. Actually, most of the Dutch people didn't leave, and the British even let Peter Stuyvesant stay. They let the Dutch have religious freedom. The Netherlands weren't in charge anymore. It was the Duke of York who owned the place now. The Duke of York was named James, and his brother was the King of England. York, that is what some people called James, was one of the owners of the Royal African Company, which controlled the British slave trade. It seemed to have occurred to the Duke that if he encouraged the use of slaves in the New World, he would make lots of money, and that is just what happened. York must have been conceited and vain, because you can see what he named his land. Well, that isn't quite true. It wasn't all called New York. Some of it became New Jersey. The Duke of York gave a big chunk of land to 2 of his friends. One of them, Sir George Carteret, came from the island of Jersey, which explains why it was New Jersey. The Duke's other friend was Lord John Berkeley. Berkeley's brother was the governor of Virginia. Top of page 189. Those 2 owners were called proprietors. They expected the people who lived on the land to pay them a tax called a quit rent. They didn't make them very popular. That didn't make them very popular. But they had good qualities all the same. They wrote a plan of government, a charter, that was the best any English colony had. It set up an assembly that represented the settlers. Assemblies, parliaments, and congresses are all similar organizations. The charter provided for freedom of religion. You could be a Quaker or a Puritan or an Anglican in New Jersey as long as you were a man. You had the right to vote. You didn't have that freedom in Massachusetts or Virginia or most of the other colonies. Soon, people were pouring into New Jersey from all over. Finns, Swedes, Germans, English, and others. In New Jersey, everybody lived together in harmony. At first, New Jersey was divided into East Jersey and West Jersey. Then the king brought out the proprietors, united New Jersey, and made it a royal colony. That meant the king was now the owner of New Jersey. He sent a royal governor to take charge and collect his rents. The king allowed the colonists to keep making their own laws through the elected assembly. For a while, New Jersey was part of a western frontier of the country. The frontier was land that was on the edge of what Europeans considered civilization. If you look at a map, you can see where the frontier of European civilization was in 1700. Page 190. A civil war in England. Even though this is a book about U.S., you need to keep up with the events in England because what was going on there was very important to the colonists in America. A civil war was being fought in England. The war was between King Charles I and the Puritans. The king lost the war. The Puritans executed him. In the colonies, Virginians were on the side of the king. People on that side were called Cavaliers. They got that name because the king's soldiers fought mostly on horseback, and the soldiers on horseback are called cavalry. The New Englanders, naturally, were for the Puritans, who were sometimes called Roundheads, because when they needed a haircut, Puritan men would put a bowl on their heads and cut around the bowl. The Revolution in 1649, and it really was a revolution, was called an English Civil War. I'll say it again, because it is so important. In 1649, the Puritans won the English Civil War, and Charles I lost his head. The English Civil War made an important point. People can change their government if they want to badly enough. After the execution of King Charles I, the Puritan leader, Oliver Cromwell, took charge of the government. I would like to tell you that Cromwell did a splendid job as ruler, but he didn't. He acted like a tyrant. When Cromwell died in 1658, the English people, who were tired of the stern Puritans, put the old king's son on the throne. He ruled as Charles II. This time in which he ruled is called the Restoration, because a king was restored to power. Under Charles II, things got so bad for the Puritans that many left England and came to America. As king, Charles II rewarded friends who had stayed loyal to his family while Cromwell was running things. He gave them gifts of land in America. As you know, he gave his brother, the Duke of York, the gift of New Netherland. Then he sent an army to take it from the Dutch. He gave the Carolinas to 8 of his favorite lords. He gave Pennsylvania to a young man whose religion made it dangerous for him to live in England. You'll meet him soon.